14 sanding discs. 1 Random Orbital Sander. Over 20 hours creating this stuff. Welcome to the Fix It Fingers Sandpaper Showdown. What I've done is I've got myself a collection of 14 different sanding pads and nets, because quite frankly I'm getting sick of burning through them and I want to figure out which one of these is the best value for money. We're ranging all the way from the absolute dead cheapest Aldi work zone right through to some of the most expensive sanding nets you can buy. Now I am a scientist, but I'm not an engineer, and we're going to be doing this in a real world scenario. There will be ways I'm sure we can improve this, but for me at least, and sharing with you, we'll get to the bottom of what sort of lifespan you can expect, and are the more expensive nets and things worth it? I'm not really looking at quality of finish. These are all 120 grit. I expect them to leave a moderately smooth surface. But if the brand is good at 120, I'm going to guess that as you go up or down the grits, you're going to have similar performance. A quick shout out, because while this isn't sponsored and I did pay for all the sandpaper here, when I was doing research, I looked up the Sandpaper Man, and he gave me a lot of really good tips on the different types of sandpaper available and what to include in this test. Alright, that's enough jibber jabbering. Let's start getting the saw elbow ready as we work our way through an awful lot of dust. Look, I know that 90% of the people here are just after the results, so I've made the decision that I'm not going to explain my scientific method too much today. Needless to say that I designed this to control as many of the variables as possible, so that I was treating every piece of sandpaper in as similar way as possible so that we get some very good comparable results. I may do another video if there is interest in explaining a bit further. But for today, in this test, we are going for speed and performance. Effectively, how many meters squared per minute we can get through with each sandpaper by erasing the lead pencil on the hardwood sleeper. When it drops below a certain threshold, I call that sandpaper done, record the results, and we move on. These are not absolute values, they are relative to the sander I am using, because I'm trying to find out what sandpaper is best for me. This will also serve to introduce the 14 different discs that I have in the testing today, and we shall do them for this performance test from the worst to the best performing sandpaper disc. Now, for some of the poorer performing sandpapers, I was actually fairly kind. I had set my cutoff at 90 seconds, but because they were so crappy, I let a few of them go. In 14th place, perhaps unsurprisingly, is the cheapest sandpaper on the menu for today, the Aldi Work Zone, which only managed 8 runs or 1.1 square meters before it was cutting so slow it couldn't get rid of the lines. In 13th place was the ironically named Irwin Pro Performance, which is a net, and it was by far the worst performing net in this particular test, clocking at 12 runs or 1.68 square meters before failing. And again, I was being generous, allowing it to go over the 90-second limit several times. In 12th place is perhaps the most recognisable sandpaper, at least for people here in Australia, because it's the one you're going to see as you head into Bunnings 9 times out of 10, FlexOvit. And it did the same number of runs as the Irwin pad, but I didn't have to cheat for it. It genuinely failed after 12 runs or 1.7 square meters, whereas I'd let the Irwin get away with a bit longer. 11th spot was taken by a brand called Smith & Arrow. It was donated by Ainsley at Small Fry Creations. Thank you for that, Ains. It was the one she's using. She is no longer, because at 11th spot it managed 14 runs and 1.96 square meters before passing it in. Now on your screen you'll also notice some extra data that I'm including about each of these discs, namely what they're made of. Primarily you're going to be seeing aluminium oxide. They are the main basic everyday sort of pads, but as the price increases we'll introduce a few new materials as well. There's some interesting discussion around that later on. In 10th spot was Norton's base entry, their H231 model. Norton have a lot of different sandpapers, and it came in at 16 passes before it failed at 2.24 square meters.
XOB01Z was the first of two Klingspor entries, the PS22, which got through 20 passes before failing, and 2.8 square meters. If all these numbers aren't making too much sense, basically just keep your eye on the chart that's coming up on screen, and you'll see lower is better in this case. The longer it goes and the lower that line stays, the better performing that sandpaper is. Now for the top 8, things get a little bit more complicated, and we will have to pay attention to the graph because I effectively stopped testing if they got through 24 or 3.36 square meters of sanding without going over 90 seconds per run. But what we can see is there is an increasing trend of efficiency. In other words, as we go up the scoreboard, we're going to find discs that cut faster for longer. So the first one in 8th position that completed the test successfully is the CER7500. That CER stands for ceramic, and there is a bit of ceramic mixed into this one. And a fun little bit of trivia, my research shows that this pad is actually pretty much identical, as in maybe just the color is the only thing varying in it from the Festool granite mesh. Talking to my source at Sandpaper Man, he is pretty convinced that they are basically the same product. So if you're running the Festool ones, then the CER7500 CER is going to be a fair comparison for you. Please don't shoot me, just the messenger on that one. And continuing on that theme, then the CS Speed 1950 is near as identical except for a slight color change to the Festool Granite Sandpaper, the regular stuff. And it came in at 7th, also clocking up 24 runs successfully, but doing so a little bit faster than its mesh equivalent, which I found quite interesting. In 6th spot, pretty much tied, almost indistinguishable from the CS Speed 1950, was the Mirka Abranet. The reason I gave it 6 over 7th is because while they finished at roughly the same speeds, up until that point, the Mirka was performing a little bit faster than the CS Speed in terms of erasing those lines, so it just edged ahead. The next one was perhaps my surprise of the whole thing. It was the Klingspor PS33, and it's just a standard aluminium oxide pad, not terribly expensive, and it did really, really well. It claimed the 5th position, being that little bit faster than the CS Speed and the Mirka. Things got pretty crowded at the top of the leaderboard. In 4th, I awarded it to Sea Top. Now, this was a slightly interesting one, apart from having a lovely blue colour. It's a zirconia, which is generally considered to be a slightly higher grade than the aluminium oxide, and it performed like it. The Sea Top 1815 took out 4th position. This next one was incredibly tough to call. There is absolutely a hair's breadth, and it's probably mildly subjective. Ultimately, I think I'm going to put Diablo in 3 and CNET 7900 in 2. Now, we'll go into value a little bit later on, but the Diablo is more expensive. However, just over the whole performance, the Sea seemed to have a slight edge on speed, even though they both again finished up at the same place. And that was pretty interesting, as Diablo nets have probably become quite popular due to their availability in Bunnings in the past year or two. However, that left one undisputed clear winner. It just blew the rest of the competition out of the water, and that was a Canadian entry from Norton. It is the A995 Blaze. Now, I believe it's actually specifically designed for metal, but the Sandpaper Man threw it in as a tester for me. It is a ceramic-based sandpaper, and it just kept going and going and going and going. Even at the final test at 24 times 3.36 square meters, it was still clocking in at 65 seconds. There was no way I was standing there until it blew out to 90, and so it was a clear winner in terms of the hardwood performance testing. So that took care of the hardwood, which was round 1. Round 2 was going to be softwood, because the way the sandpaper performs on these pine bed slats is going to be quite different to how it did on that giant old sleeper. Also, most of what I do in my shop, at least, is softwood, so this will be a meaningful test for that. Then we can compare the best value at the end. Importantly, I made sure I chopped out all of the knots, which there were many, in the bed slats, and I checked the density of the pieces of wood. They're all roughly 100 grams, give or take. I did design this hilarious little jig and wasted a whole day on it, because ultimately, while very fun looking, it didn't really work too well. It was very inconsistent. Pressure wasn't right. It just didn't replicate real sanding. So we had to go back to a different solution. I spent all night dreaming up some more complicated versions to try and stabilize the sander. And in the end, I came up with this. Taking a leaf out of Dirk and Chris from Measure Twice, Cut Once's last episode on Keeping It Simple, Stupid. That's what we got. Which means I'm going to be standing here manually sanding each piece as my little jig holds it firmly in place and reweighing every 5 minutes to see how much material has been taken away. The jig does come with one very important feature, however. Another tripod with Dana design on it. Ooh, pallet buster. Alright, earpods in. This is going to take a long time, but at least I know the result will be good. As we already know what the sandpapers are, and to save a bit of time, I've arranged these results into tiers. So we'll look at them in groups of similar performance. And here are the bottom of the pack, the worst 3 performing. And look, the Irwin Pro, I just really don't know what's going on with that. It's not cheap, it's really different, it's a net, and it sucks, quite frankly, at least in the way that I've been using it. Took out the unlucky 13th position. No surprises at Aldi Work Zone. It is the absolute cheapest thing that you can buy, and it shows, coming in last. The Norton 231, also similar sort of performance here, but again, it's Norton's cheapest one. Now, in terms of failure for this test, effectively the target is 1 gram of bed slat removal per minute. And here, when it fails that test twice, we'll call that paper done and move on to the next one. Now, this is probably a good benchmark, as again, we'll mention the FlexOvit here in Australia as being the bog standard sort of Bunnings big box store sandpaper. And I was really confused for a moment because it looks like I've only added 2 lines to the graph, yet we've got 4 sandpapers here. And that's because the FlexOvit and Smith & Arrow were exactly, and I mean exactly, the same in terms of their data points. They completely overlap each other for equal 10th position. The same can be said with the Klingspor family. The PS22 and the PS33 performed a bit better, getting equal 8th, but for a second time, completely amazingly, the data points for both of those sandpapers were identical. Very, very fun little data confusion going on there. Our mid-tiers on softwood provided the most interesting results, I think, of this whole testing shenanigans, and that was that we have the winner and the 3rd place getter of the hardwood test down here languishing in the middle. And I've got some thoughts on that, which I recorded while testing and had a chat to the sandpaper man and sort of confirmed what was going on. Here's a brief explanation of my theory. Oh, that's my penultimate piece of sandpaper, and I've actually hit not a snag, but a curiosity. It's one of the more expensive nets that I purchased, and in my previous test on the sleeper, it performed quite well. It hasn't lived up to the expectations on this softwood, but the culprit might actually be my little sander here. These more premium discs are really, I think, designed for the more powerful sanders. This only has a 2.6mm stroke on it, I think, and is obviously battery powered, whereas if you had a Rotex or one of the larger Bosch units that have a 5mm stroke on the sanding, and perhaps even the 6-inch discs instead of the 5-inch discs, that's what these discs are designed for. So while I'm not going to record the results officially, what I want to do now is go to town on this disc. I want to push this thing really, really into the wood and see if by aggravating it, in other words, trying to imitate a more powerful sanding machine, I can get the results that I was expecting. As I suspected it would, absolutely destroyed this piece of wood when I pushed it really hard. And just by feeling how much grit is left in there, I am very certain that it could keep doing that over and over again. However, that's going to be beyond the scope of this experimentation because I'm trying to find the best sandpaper for my sander. And yes, if I had a more powerful, larger Bosch, Rotex, whatever, this sandpaper here would probably keep on going super hard. But the fact of the matter is, it's already failed my regular use twice, and so I'm going to cut it off and I'm not going to count that last result. So just something for you to think about, that These results were never going to be clear-cut and straightforward, and your circumstances are different to mine, and so you may need to consider looking into some options which I am currently ruling out. 5th, Norton. 6th, Sear Speed / Festool, and 7th, the Sear Net. Now we get up to places where if you have spent your money on these and you have a similar sander to mine, you can be very happy that your purchase was probably a good one. 4th position went to the odd zirconia Sear Top 1815. 3rd position went to the Diablo Sand Net, and 2nd, in complete contradiction to what I just said about the more expensive ceramic pads earlier, the Sear Net CER 7500 did excessively well, taking the silver medal. That means that just like the last time, we've got one clear winner. And it is, of course, the Mirka Abranet. Just an aluminium oxide pad, but it blew the competition out of the water. It chewed through those bed slats like there was no tomorrow, and even after 2 solid hours of sanding, it did not look like it was giving up until right at the very end when it failed the test on the last 2 runs that I was going to give it. I have a small theory here of why this one worked so much better than some of the ceramic and other expensive pads. Dust extraction. Now, this is going to lead us down a whole nother path that we don't have time to go in today, but if my crappy Ryobi dust extractor and the design of the Makita, which obviously doesn't have fantastic dust extraction compared to some of the bigger sanders, were better, you would probably have found that some of those ceramic ones performed better again. I can't really go into that comparison further for you guys today, but for me and for these small random orbitals, when you have a nice open weave like the Diablo, like the Abranet, that extra suction you get from destroying a lot of soft material like pine or plywood or MDF really helps to have the open weave of the nets, and I think that's going to be one of the big takeaways from there, if not a terribly large revelation. So we have a clear winner for the hardwood and a clear winner for the softwood bed slat destruction tests. They are not the same, and there's a final data point we need to consider: cost, because I am a tight ass and I want to know what value I'm going to get. So here is my price table. Obviously they are in Australian dollars and the prices are going to vary over time and depending on where you are. But I had to do something in order to rank these from first to worst. And the only real kicker here is a couple of the ones that are starred, such as the Diablo Sand Net. The reason that they've gone particularly poorly is because you simply can't buy them in large boxes. At least I couldn't find them. So all the prices here are on boxes of 50. Now I know a lot of people don't want to buy boxes of sandpaper that big and you're going to be buying them by the tens. But quite frankly, the price is half if you can get them in the bulk buys, just like most things, and I would highly recommend it. So that's the metric that I have used for my comparison today.
Hallelujah, we're done. Many weeks, many hours, 14 sandpapers, hardwood test, softwood test, and if we've learned anything, that little Makita router is an absolute weapon. Jesus, it's done well. The shop vac, well, it's kind of dusty in here, but you can't really blame it. We have destroyed so many bed slats, it's just ridiculous. Finally though, I can go and have a shower and get myself brushed off, crunch some Excel data, and print some lovely charts which will hopefully demonstrate which of these sandpapers I'm going to commit to and which I'll spend my money on, and summarise the findings.
And here they are. Now you're going to have to decide with your sander and your workshop which of these 3 categories you want to give the highest priority to. Me, I'm a softwood kind of guy most of the time, and as I said, I don't like spending too much. Whichever way you cut it though, you are going to be very hard pressed to go past the Mirka Abranet. They're not that expensive when you buy them in bulk, and it just performed so solidly, topping out the softwood and doing reasonably well on the hardwood. It's just going to be hard for me, I think, to choose anything else. But if I am going to look elsewhere, then we're looking at the Sear Top and the Sear Speed. They were very solid performers, and again, not super duper expensive, so if you're going to invest, they would be the next 2 to look at. As we said, if you do have one of the larger sanders, then perhaps giving a crack on the ceramics might be a go for you. I reckon they will last just about forever. However, they are more costly to outlay on, so there are a lot of factors to consider in your final decision. That was a really long video, and I do thank you for hanging around with me today. There was a heap of material to get through, and I hope at least this has given you some guidance as to the sandpaper that you're going to choose for your workshop going forwards. No, I couldn't test all of them, and yes, there are a lot of things that could be done better, but we've got to draw the line somewhere, and today that line is right here. Thanks a lot, and I will catch you on the next one.
We're done! Done.